Welcome to Life Stories, where sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Imagine being there for someone every single day, supporting them through their darkest moments, only to find out that when you need them most, you're the one left behind. Sophie gave everything to her family, her time, her love, her sacrifices. But when it came time for her to be seen, to be appreciated, they turned away. And that was the moment everything changed. What would you do if the people you loved most made you feel invisible? Would you fight for their approval? Or would you walk away and choose yourself? Stay with us as Sophie embarks on a journey that could either destroy her or set her free. Sophie sat on the worn leather couch of her small apartment, her laptop open before her, yet it felt as though the screen had turned into a lifeless object. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but her mind was far from the digital world in front of her. The soft hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost as if the entire world had paused to give her space to breathe. But she couldn't breathe. Not right now. Her phone buzzed again, the message lighting up her screen. It was from Luke, her younger brother, who had just returned from his 18-month military service. A service she had supported him through every single day, sending care packages, staying up late to talk to him when the loneliness threatened to crush him. She had sacrificed so much for him, yet now, here she was, staring at his words, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in her chest. Just a heads up, Sophie. The guest list for this weekend's party is final. We had to cut a few people to fit everyone in, and unfortunately, you didn't make the cut. Hope you understand. The words stabbed into her, their coldness sharp and unmistakable. Sophie's chest tightened, and she stared at the message, waiting for the second half. The follow-up message. Something like, "Just kidding, you're the most important one," or "We couldn't have the party without you." But no, nothing. Just a finality that stung with its cruelty. She wanted to scream, to call him, to demand answers. But instead, she sat frozen, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the phone. The message remained unblinking, and Sophie couldn't stop herself from scrolling through old photos on her phone. Photos of Luke's grateful texts, of the countless times she had been there for him, and of the small victories she had celebrated with him from afar. The homemade cookies she'd sent him, the late-night calls to make sure he wasn't overwhelmed by homesickness, the love she poured into every detail of his engagement party invitation. And now, she was the one left out, not just ignored, but dismissed completely. Her heart pounded in her chest as she called her father. His voice came through the line, as familiar as ever, laced with a calmness that only seemed to aggravate the situation further. "Hey, sweetheart, what's going on?" "I'm not on the guest list for Luke's party, Dad. You knew about this, didn't you?" A pause. Then a sigh, heavy with the kind of weariness that Sophie had come to recognize all too well. "Sophie, don't overreact. It's just a family get-together. We're trying to keep it small. You know how it is. Space is tight." Space is tight. Sophie felt the words echo in her mind, bouncing off the walls of the apartment like a mocking refrain. "Space is tight?" she repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "I just saw Luke's Instagram post. 80 names, Dad. Distant relatives, people he met a few months ago. And me? I'm the one who didn't make the cut. I'm his sister, his flesh and blood. Don't you think I deserve a seat at the table?" There was another awkward pause on the other end of the line. Then her father's voice, quiet and strained. "Those people RSVP'd early. We're just trying to keep it simple. Don't take it personally, Sophie." She could feel her pulse in her ears, the pressure building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Don't take it personally," she repeated, her words thick with disbelief. She was the one who had been there for him when he was struggling with basic training, when their parents were too distracted to even remember to send him a care package. She was the one who had stayed up late, talking him through every hard day, and now she was nothing more than a name crossed off a list. Sophie ended the call, her fingers shaking as she set the phone down. The message from Luke still lingered on her screen. Not enough space. How could he not see how much he was hurting her? It wasn't just a party, it was a slap in the face, a reminder that all the years she had spent giving without asking for anything in return meant nothing to him. Sophie didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the screen, before she finally stood up, her heart echoing with a silent resolve. She wasn't going to take this anymore. The next morning, Sophie packed her things. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. No one had cared about her feelings before. Why would they start now? She grabbed her coat, her bag, and her phone and walked out the door without a single glance back. Her destination was Aspen, Colorado, a place she had always dreamed of visiting, a place where she could finally find peace. The snow-covered mountains, the quiet beauty of the lodge nestled in the woods, it was exactly what she needed. A retreat, a chance to breathe, a chance to be free from the expectations and betrayals that had suffocated her for so long. When she arrived at White Pine Lodge, the crisp air filled her lungs like a breath of fresh clarity. The sight of the snow-dusted trees and the tranquil stillness of the surroundings gave her the space she needed to think. She didn't need anyone's permission to exist. She had been living for everyone else for so long, always prioritizing their needs before her own. But not anymore. This was her time. She posted a picture from her cabin window, an image of the frozen lake, the snow-covered pines, the sun setting in the distance. The caption was simple. Not on the list? Then make your own list. She scheduled it to go live right when Luke's party would be starting back home. The reactions were immediate, and they flooded her phone. Her mom was the first to text. "What are you doing, Sophie? This isn't the way to handle things." Followed by a string of messages from Luke, Mia, and even her father, each one more guilt-laden than the last. But Sophie didn't respond. She didn't need to explain herself to them anymore. She had made her choice, and this time, she wasn't going to second-guess it. Later that night, Sophie sat by the fire in the lodge, a glass of red wine in hand, as she watched the flames dance. She could feel the tension of the past few days, no, the past few years, slowly melting away. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Truly free. Not burdened by anyone else's expectations or guilt. The next day, as she skied down the slopes, feeling the wind rush past her, Sophie realized something. She hadn't just left a party behind. She had left a life that no longer served her, a life where she was always the one picking up the pieces. And in its place, she was finally starting to live for herself. What would it feel like to put your own happiness first, without the fear of disappointing others? Would you choose to walk away from the people who have always overlooked you? Sophie's journey had just begun, and as she stood at the peak of the mountain, watching the vast landscape unfold before her, she knew that her decision to leave had been the hardest and most freeing thing she'd ever done. The question now was, could she keep this new version of herself alive once she returned to the world she'd left behind? The days at White Pine Lodge passed like a slow, gentle snowfall. Sophie reveled in the solitude, letting the crisp mountain air cleanse the fog that had clouded her mind for so long. Every morning, she would wake to the quiet hum of nature outside her cabin window, and every evening she'd sit by the fire, a glass of wine in hand, watching the flames flicker and dance. It was the peace she'd longed for, the freedom she desperately needed. But even in this sanctuary, something stirred within her, a nagging voice that wouldn't let her rest. The phone calls from her family had stopped coming. At first, that silence had felt like a victory. Sophie had thought she could escape the weight of their expectations, their guilt trips, their constant need to turn her into the family fixer. But as the days wore on, she realized she wasn't just escaping them. She was running from something deeper, the truth about herself, the painful reality that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been running away at all. Perhaps she was just afraid of standing still and confronting the truth about her own worth. Sophie had spent her life being the dependable one, the one who always showed up, even when she didn't want to, the one who put everyone else's needs before her own, the sister who dropped everything to help, the daughter who made sacrifices to keep the peace. But now, in the quiet of this mountain retreat, Sophie could feel the slow burning resentment bubbling beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the party, about being excluded from her brother's welcome home celebration. No, it was about everything. Every moment she had given away to others, thinking she was doing the right thing. Every ounce of herself she had given away in the hope of being seen, being valued, being loved in return. As the days stretched on, Sophie began to notice something within her changing. She was no longer haunted by the idea of being cut out. Instead, she began to feel angry, angry at her own blind loyalty, at the way she had let herself be molded into someone else's idea of what she should be. The guilt she'd been carrying for years began to shift into a quiet, simmering anger. And with that anger came a strange sense of clarity. But just as Sophie was starting to embrace this new version of herself, just as she was finally starting to shed the weight of her family's expectations, a message came through on her phone. It was from her cousin, Carla, the only one in the family who still seemed to understand her, who still reached out without any strings attached. Her message was short, but packed a punch. "Vic, you're not going to believe this. Mom called. They're having a family meeting next week, and guess what? You're on the guest of honor list. She wants you to come back. They want to clear the air." Sophie stared at the message for a long time, her breath catching in her throat. A guest of honor? Her mother, the one who had never truly seen her, was now trying to pull her back into the fold. Was this a true attempt at reconciliation? Or was it another way to manipulate her back into the same old role? The thought of returning, of walking back into the same suffocating family dynamic, made her stomach turn. But what if this was her chance? What if, for once, she could return and show them who she really was? Not the person they had tried to make her, but the person she was becoming. Sophie stood up from her seat by the fire, pacing the small cabin as she thought through the message again and again. The tension inside her was unbearable. On one hand, she was tempted by the idea of finally being recognized, of receiving the validation she'd never gotten. On the other hand, there was the knowledge that going back would mean slipping back into the same destructive patterns, the same cycle of giving until it broke her. She pulled out her phone, hesitated for a moment, and then opened the family group chat. The messages were still there, stacked one on top of the other, a constant stream of guilt and shame from her mother, her father, and even Luke. Sophie's eyes drifted to the message from Mia, Luke's fiancée. "You're putting Noah in a tough spot." Mia had written, her words dripping with the same disapproval that Sophie had felt for years. It hit her then, like a cold slap to the face. She was still the problem. Even after everything she had done for them, she was still the one to blame. Sophie couldn't help but laugh bitterly. How many times had she bent over backward for them? How many times had she put herself last, just to make sure they didn't have to feel uncomfortable, to make sure they didn't have to deal with the consequences of their own actions? She had always been the one to smooth things over, to make everyone happy, to keep the peace. But now, as she stood in the stillness of her cabin, it felt like a cruel joke. The door creaked open, and Sophie stepped outside into the cold air, her breath rising in the frosty morning light. The world was quiet, so still, and the weight of the decision ahead of her pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. She looked out at the mountain peaks, the snow-capped trees, and realized with a jolt that she had no idea what she was going to do. She had spent so long being the peacekeeper, the one who never rocked the boat, but now she didn't know who she was without that role. Without her family's constant demands and expectations, who was she really? And more importantly, could she live without them? Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. She had been running for so long, running from her family, from herself. But now, as she stood here on this mountain, the questions that had been plaguing her for years started to feel clearer. Maybe running away wasn't the answer. Maybe she needed to face her family, face the people who had shaped her, and finally stand up for herself. Maybe she needed to be the one to call the shots, to set the boundaries that had always been missing. But then, Another message came through on her phone, interrupting her thoughts. It was from Carla again. I don't know what's going on with you, but I have to tell you, it's all falling apart. Luke's party turned into a disaster. Mom and Dad are panicking, and I don't know if you'll ever forgive them, but they're begging for your forgiveness. They're scared they've lost you. Sophie's heart lurched. The familiar ache returned, the ache of being needed, of being wanted, but only when it suited them. She could feel the pull, the familiar tug of family, but this time she didn't know if she could go back. Would you be able to forgive the people who never saw your worth until it was too late? Could you walk away from a life that has always defined you, even if it meant losing everything you once knew? The decision lay heavy on Sophie's shoulders. Could she go back to her family and find healing? Or was this the moment she would finally break free of everything that had held her captive for so long? One thing was certain. Whatever she chose, there would be no going back. The phone buzzed again, but this time Sophie didn't look at it. She didn't need to. The answer was inside her, and it was time to stop running. The question was whether she was ready to face the consequences of that choice. Sophie sat in her cabin, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Her fingers hovered above her phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. She had been avoiding the flood of messages from her family, avoiding the guilt, the apologies, the pleas to come back. But now, after days of contemplation, she couldn't help but open the messages again. The texts from Carla had stopped. No more offers of intervention, no more demands. The family was silent, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie found that silence comforting. But now, there was another message. It was from Luke. I didn't want it to be like this. You know I never meant to hurt you. I wish you could just come back. Sophie stared at the words, the familiar pain of being caught in his world, in the world of expectations and broken promises, washing over her. She had been here before, too many times. Luke always needed her, but when it came to showing up for her, it was as if she didn't exist. She had always been the one who bent, the one who sacrificed, the one who made it work. But now, for the first time, Sophie felt the weight of what she had given up for that family. She sat there, phone in hand, her heart heavy, but strangely steady. The ache had dulled, replaced by something stronger, a sense of clarity. She wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but in the stillness of these mountains, away from all the noise and chaos of her family's demands, Sophie had finally found her voice. Not the voice they had tried to mold, but her own. And that voice wasn't going to let her be anyone's second choice anymore. Taking a deep breath, Sophie placed the phone down on the table. She didn't need to reply to Luke's message. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. Sophie had already made her choice. She wasn't going to return to the role she had always played in their lives. The one who fixed things, who forgave everything, who put her own needs last. This time, she was choosing herself. The phone buzzed again, this time a message from her mother. Sophie, please come home. This isn't like you. We need you. Luke needs you. You can't just walk away from your family. Sophie's chest tightened as she read the message, her mother's words echoing in her mind. For years, she had done just that. Walked away from her own life in order to keep the peace, to be the one who held everything together. She had put their needs ahead of hers, sacrificed her own happiness, hoping one day they would see her, really see her. But that day never came. Her mother's words felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of all the times she had been expected to sacrifice without question. And now, when Sophie finally had the courage to walk away, to choose herself, her family wanted to pull her back into the same old pattern. They needed her? No, they didn't need her. They needed the version of her that didn't question, that didn't ask for anything in return. Sophie stood up, the weight of the message heavy in her hand. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet, snow-covered landscape. The mountains stood tall, unmoving, untouched by the chaos of the world. She thought about the years she had spent running after their approval, trying to be everything they needed her to be, and how little they had ever given in return. But now she was standing on her own. She was her own person, and that person didn't need anyone's approval to feel whole. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't pick it up. She had made her decision. The family she had once tried so hard to belong to fix, to make proud, was not the family she needed to be part of anymore. They didn't understand her. They didn't understand her worth. But Sophie understood herself now, and that was enough. She had taken the steps to get here, to this moment. She wasn't the person they had wanted her to be, and she wasn't going to be the person they needed her to be. She was done. The next morning, Sophie woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the snow-covered mountains. She packed her things, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't know what awaited her when she returned home, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of losing them, because, for the first time, she realized that she wasn't the one losing anything. It was them. She left the cabin, taking one last look at the mountains that had given her so much peace. She walked to the front desk to check out, the receptionist giving her a warm smile as she handed Sophie the bill. But Sophie didn't care about the cost anymore. She had paid a far higher price in staying in the shadows of her family for so long. As she drove away from White Pine Lodge, the cold air filling the car, Sophie felt the weight of the past few days finally begin to lift. It wasn't the weight of her family's expectations anymore. It was her own. Her own burden of guilt, of self-doubt, was finally gone. She was free. When she got home, Sophie didn't immediately go back to her old life. She didn't answer the phone calls from her mother, didn't respond to Luke's messages. She didn't need to. She had already made her decision. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. Sophie spent the next few weeks focusing on herself. She started therapy, something she had always wanted to do but had put off for too long. She spent time with friends who respected her, who saw her for who she was, and didn't ask her to be anyone else. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild herself, piece by piece. And with every passing day, Sophie felt stronger, more confident, and more at peace than she had ever felt before. Then one afternoon, as she sat in her apartment, sipping coffee and listening to music, she got a text from Carla. It was short, but it hit Sophie harder than anything she had expected. "Mom wants to meet. She said she doesn't know how to fix things anymore without you. She's sorry." Sophie stared at the message, the words sinking into her like heavy stones. She had spent so many years waiting for this apology, for this acknowledgement. But now, she wasn't sure it mattered anymore. She had learned something on that mountain. It wasn't the apology she needed. It was the freedom to live her life without constantly trying to fix everything for everyone else. She put the phone down and smiled to herself. Sophie had walked away from a life that never truly saw her. And now, for the first time, she was choosing to live for herself. And that was enough. How do you know when it's time to stop fixing things for others and start living for yourself? How far can you go before you realize the only way forward is to leave behind the past? If you've ever struggled with choosing yourself over the expectations of others, share your thoughts below. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to comment 100 if this story touched your heart. Share it with your friends, and thank you for joining us at Life Stories.